The Nevada desert erupted in sudden light. An amber sphere hovered above the ridge, utterly still, as if watching. Along Highway 375, tourists froze with cameras half raised. In the silence, only the wind moved. No one knew, secret test or something not of this world. The Nevada desert stretched outward in silence, a silence so complete that even the wind seemed hesitant to move across the flat expanse of sand and stone. Around Groom Lake, a dry basin etched into the landscape like a scar from a time when water had once existed. The air carried no sound beyond the occasional rattle of gravel dislodged by shifting heat. In the summer, the ground baked into brittle plates that cracked under weight. In the winter, cold descended swiftly, pressing against the surface until even the desert shrubs bent under frost. It was in this space, stripped of life and emptied of comfort, that the United States built a place designed to be unseen. In 1955, the government took possession of Groom Lake as though it had been waiting all along for human intervention. What began as a temporary airstrip for testing the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft turned into a labyrinth of secrecy. Runways stretched across the flat, dry lake bed like precise scars drawn with mechanical certainty. Hangars rose from the earth, windowless and muted, their walls painted in tones that absorbed sunlight without reflection. Roads uncoiled from the complex and vanished into the surrounding desert, as though leading nowhere, serving more to confuse than to direct. From the air, the arrangement resembled a sterile pattern, a geometry of silence laid over dust. The perimeter hardened quickly. Signs were erected at intervals that warned in clear and final language, "Do not enter, use of deadly force authorized." Fences, cameras, and motion detectors grew outward like an artificial skin surrounding the base. Beyond them, white pickup trucks fitted with antennas lingered in the hills, their engines idling without sound, their occupants hidden behind tinted glass. Locals gave them names, camo dudes, watchers, ghosts, but no one ever heard them speak. They existed only as eyes and hands of something larger, an unseen structure of authority. Radio silence was absolute. Frequencies in the region often collapsed into static without cause. Pilots passing overhead on commercial flights recorded sudden distortions, brief interruptions, as though the sky itself refused transmission above the base. Civilian aircraft were instructed to divert miles away, leaving a hollow circle of forbidden airspace that hung invisibly in the desert sky. To look upon Groom Lake from above was to see absence itself, a void that swallowed signals and erased presence. At night, the stillness of the desert became something heavier. Local residents of Rachel and Alamo, small communities scattered on the edges of Highway 375, grew accustomed to lights that did not follow the rules of aviation. They rose vertically without acceleration, glided laterally without noise, and disappeared with no transition. These displays occurred with irregular rhythm, sometimes not appearing for months, then re-emerging across consecutive nights. To the people who lived within sight of Groom Lake, they were not stories, but seasonal events, expected in the same way as storms or heat waves. From the ground, the base itself remained strangely unremarkable, almost blank. During the day, it appeared as nothing more than pale runways, sand-colored hangars, and water towers blending into stone ridges. Yet its sterility was its most unsettling feature. There were no windows, no sound of construction, no sense of life. Dust storms passed through without leaving marks on the surfaces. Heat waves rippled, yet the buildings seemed immune to distortion. To approach from any direction was to encounter emptiness, a horizon that did not shift until suddenly confronted by fences and warnings. For those who attempted to push closer, the desert provided its own defenses. Temperatures soared high enough to blur vision and fracture concentration. The terrain stretched outward without landmarks, making distances deceptive, punishing those who miscalculated. Visitors who wandered too long risked dehydration and disorientation. By the time fences came into view, exhaustion had already settled deep into the body. The environment was not merely background, it was the first layer of security. Even the name was impersonal. Official documents did not call it Groom Lake or refer to hidden projects. Instead, the designation was plain, a number within a grid, Area 51. That sterility turned into symbol. Among the few who lived within range of its horizon, the phrase carried weight heavier than maps could hold. It meant secrecy pressed into the land, an emptiness that consumed questions. Over decades, it became a cipher, a shorthand for things unseen, a placeholder for everything the desert would not allow to be spoken. Satellite imagery confirmed what few could witness directly. The runways lengthened over the years, stretching across the lakebed until they appeared to merge with the horizon. Additional hangars appeared, rectangular and vast, positioned at angles that denied observation. Fuel tanks, communication arrays, and service roads spread outward like veins beneath pale skin. But despite expansion, the base never revealed itself. Every addition was silent, constructed behind closed perimeters, finished before anyone outside could ask questions. Growth occurred without evidence of process, as if the desert rearranged itself to accommodate new forms. The air above Groom Lake remained unusual. Pilots of civilian airlines who strayed near the restricted zone sometimes reported distortions, flashes, or moments when their instruments faltered. The official explanation cited atmospheric refraction or navigational error, but the consistency with which instruments behaved irregularly in that space lent weight to other interpretations. Something about the air above Area 51 resisted mapping, resisted being measured. Stories emerged of dust devils circling endlessly above the dry lake, not breaking apart as natural winds would dictate. Hikers in the far hills told of low vibrations at night, not sounds but sensations traveling through stone and soil. Amateur radio operators described bursts of unidentifiable signals, short pulses that began and ended with abrupt finality, too controlled to be random noise, too brief to be traced. Every detail added to the impression that Groom Lake was not merely a location, but an influence radiating outward. The desert itself bore scars of use. Long tracks carved by heavy vehicles marked the sand but often led to nowhere, vanishing into dunes or ending abruptly at ridges. Concrete pads stood abandoned, stripped of purpose, their surfaces cracked yet curiously clean. Some observers noted the absence of birds above the perimeter, an unnatural quiet that excluded even scavengers. Coyotes skirted wide arcs around the fences. Even insects seemed sparse in the immediate area, as though the land had been trained into silence. From a distance, the entire site resembled a mirage that refused to vanish. It appeared solid and geometric against a background of disorder, yet the closer one attempted to see, the less detail became available. Photographs blurred, cameras malfunctioned, dust obscured lines, and distance distorted scale. The base resisted definition, remaining perpetually between presence and absence. For the United States government, Area 51 existed in paperwork as a line item among many, buried within contracts and appropriations. For the desert, it became a foreign organ implanted into stone. For locals, it was a horizon marked by light and silence. Over time, these perspectives fused into a myth that was not entirely myth. The reality was more unsettling. Area 51 was both ordinary and extraordinary, a strip of asphalt and metal in the desert, and simultaneously a wound carved into perception itself. To stand near Groom Lake was to confront absence. No sound carried outward, no windows revealed activity, no evidence connected past to present. And yet the feeling persisted that something moved inside, something constant, indifferent, and concealed. The desert held it without question, as if the earth itself had been persuaded to remain silent. The land that once held water now held secrets, and it seemed content to keep them buried. The legend of Area 51 did not erupt suddenly. It began slowly, almost quietly, carried on the edges of airwaves and whispered among pilots who lived in the space between routine flight plans and the vast unknown. In the late 1950s, commercial aviators crossing Nevada airspace began to report unusual lights above the desert. These lights appeared as small luminous points that shifted too abruptly to be mistaken for known aircraft. They darted laterally across the horizon, then stopped in place as though fixed by invisible anchors, before accelerating vertically with a precision that defied gravity. At the time, the official explanation pointed to high-altitude testing of reconnaissance planes, particularly the U-2, which was being pushed beyond the known ceiling of civilian aviation. Yet the pilots themselves, trained to recognize aircraft silhouettes, navigation lights, and altitudes, insisted that what they had witnessed was unlike anything they had ever encountered. By the early 1960s, the reports multiplied. Law enforcement across Nevada recorded statements from motorists, night shift workers, and ranchers who claimed to see strange glows hovering above the Groom Lake region. Some lights drifted like lanterns in a windless sky. Others shot upward and vanished as though pulled into the void. Police records categorized these incidents as unconfirmed aerial phenomena, stamped with bureaucratic finality before being filed away, never investigated further. The paper trail suggested indifference, but beneath the surface a new kind of mythology was forming. The desert was no longer just emptiness, it was a stage where something appeared, briefly, then dissolved back into silence. The U-2 program, shrouded in secrecy, was one of the first elements to fuel speculation. Its unusual flight characteristics, flying at altitudes above 60,000 feet, where no commercial aircraft could reach, created a visible presence that often startled unknowing observers. To those on the ground, a silver fuselage glinting against the dusk sky looked like a star that had suddenly begun to move. Air traffic controllers, unfamiliar with the classified program, logged sightings that did not match any known aircraft registry. These inconsistencies spread through communities like Rachel and Alamo, where locals compared notes and arrived at a single conclusion. The government was flying something beyond ordinary imagination, yet the sightings contained details that did not align with even the most advanced reconnaissance platforms. Witnesses described sudden accelerations that seemed instantaneous, objects shifting directions at 90-degree angles, or lights vanishing without trace. Engineers and scientists might have explained these away as atmospheric reflections or experimental propulsion systems, but for those watching with naked eyes, they were clear and undeniable. The unexplained quality of these events became their power. The less people understood, the more certain they became that something extraordinary was unfolding over the desert. By the mid-1960s, the A-12 Oxcart had entered testing at Groom Lake, an aircraft designed to reach speeds over Mach 3 and altitudes exceeding 80,000 feet. Its unique titanium frame reflected sunlight in irregular flashes, often producing luminous effects at high altitude. Civilian pilots frequently mistook these test flights for luminous, unidentified objects. Commercial crews flying routes between Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Salt Lake City filed reports of glowing forms moving faster than any known jet. On clear nights, even distant residents observed bright streaks across the horizon, vanishing into silence. Officials reassured the public that nothing unusual had occurred, but in the absence of explanation, speculation hardened into conviction. Local newspapers occasionally printed short articles about these encounters. Headlines spoke of mysterious lights over Nevada or unknown aircraft seen by motorists. The stories rarely lasted more than a day before being overshadowed by other news, yet they left impressions that lingered longer than official silence. Each report reinforced the idea that something hidden was taking place in Groom Lake. The desert was no longer simply empty land leased to the military, it became a theater of secrecy where witnesses glimpsed fragments of what should not exist. The 1960s also witnessed the emergence of the wider UFO phenomenon in American culture. The post-war decades had already given rise to Roswell, the Washington, D.C. sightings of 1952, and the growing subculture of enthusiasts who collected, catalogued, and debated unexplained aerial encounters. Area 51, though never officially acknowledged, slipped naturally into this narrative. It offered a physical location for stories that demanded a setting, a place where secrecy and sky converged. The lights over Groom Lake became not just local mysteries, but entries in a national ledger of the unknown. Police archives from small Nevada towns contained references to strange aerial activity near Groom Lake. One 1964 entry noted multiple calls from motorists describing a glowing sphere above Highway 375. The responding deputy arrived at the site but reported no visible craft. The file was closed with the notation unsubstantiated. Another log from 1967 recorded 3 ranch hands who described a bright triangle of lights hovering silently for nearly 10 minutes before vanishing vertically. Their statement ended in the same way, not confirmed. Each report, while officially dismissed, added to a pattern that became undeniable in collective memory. The ambiguity worked in favor of the legend. For every official claim of experimental aircraft, there was an equally persuasive testimony describing behavior impossible for known technology. As a result, Area 51 became a paradox. Either the site hosted human machines decades ahead of their time, or it concealed encounters with something non-human. The inability to decide between these options made the place larger than itself. To some, it was the cutting edge of science. To others, it was a window into the unknown. Stories circulated among pilots that they were instructed not to record unusual sightings near Nevada. Reports that reached the Federal Aviation Administration were occasionally redirected or erased. Civilian radar operators in the region sometimes noted echoes that appeared briefly, hovered, then disappeared without trace. These blips never entered official logs. Rumors suggested that the government deliberately obscured these records, folding them into broader classifications such as instrument error or atmospheric interference. The lack of answers became an answer in itself. As the decade turned, locals in the desert towns adopted their own vocabulary for what they saw. The fast lights, the silent stars, the watchers. None of the terms carried technical authority, but each revealed the persistence of memory. Farmers spoke of livestock startled by unseen forces, of fences humming as though struck by invisible waves. Truck drivers described engines stuttering on long desert roads while luminous points hovered silently nearby. These accounts rarely reached beyond the county line, yet within the communities they became threads of a shared narrative. The desert was alive with something that could not be spoken aloud. By the late 1960s, the legend had solidified. Groom Lake was no longer simply a test site for reconnaissance aircraft. It was a place of dual identity, officially absent, yet publicly omnipresent. The name Area 51 circulated without official confirmation, whispered in bars, printed in small newsletters, spoken by those who felt they had seen too much to remain silent. The secrecy of the government and the persistence of unexplained sightings fused together, creating a myth that felt stronger than fact. Area 51's legend was not born from a single event. It grew from accumulation, from the steady layering of reports, dismissals, and silences. Each unexplained light, each file marked unconfirmed, each witness ignored became part of a larger architecture. The desert itself carried these impressions, holding them in stillness until they were too many to deny. By the end of the 1960s, Area 51 had become not only a geographical site, but a symbol, a name that suggested more than it revealed, a legend that was both shield and mirror. The legend's origin lay not in certainty, but in contradiction. Was the government hiding technology far beyond the public's grasp, or were they concealing encounters with something not of this earth? No answer was provided, and in that void of explanation, the legend grew stronger. Area 51 became less about what was known and more about what was withheld, less about evidence and more about absence. It was the desert's silence, repeated and magnified, that allowed a myth to become immortal. The desert horizon had always carried a silence that seemed eternal, but on certain nights the stillness fractured with sudden light. The first well-documented case tied to the Groom Lake region came on July 12, 1964, when a group of tourists camped near Papoose Lake described seeing a luminous object hanging above the mountains. Their notes, later written in travel journals and postcards that survived in family archives, described a disc-shaped form, glowing in a steady silver-white radiance that stood out against the night. They watched as the object hovered for nearly a minute, suspended with unnatural steadiness. Then, without any visible transition, it accelerated to the north, vanishing in less than a second, leaving behind no trail, no echo, only the memory of light receding into emptiness. That night was clear, with no cloud cover to distort stars or produce reflections. The group included amateur photographers, but in the time it took them to prepare their equipment, the object had already gone. Later, when they reported the incident to local authorities, their words were catalogued and quietly set aside. The file was marked as an unverified civilian observation, and no further action was taken. Yet the story lingered in the communities along the desert's edge, where the stillness of the land made every anomaly impossible to forget. 3 years later, in October 1967, another report emerged, this time from park rangers working within a national preserve near the Groom Lake perimeter. Their patrols had grown accustomed to the silence of wildlife at night, the natural chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. On one evening, the chorus fell away, leaving only the dry rustle of wind. Looking east, they observed a column of light rising vertically from beyond the mountains. Unlike a flare which burned with irregular flickers, this light was smooth, unwavering, and pale. One ranger, carrying a camera intended for cataloging wildlife activity, managed to capture a single frame. The photograph showed nothing of structure, only a vertical streak cutting the sky, too sharp to be dismissed as lens error, too brief to be explained by conventional flight. The image was sent to a regional office, logged with a neutral description: light trace observed during night patrol. Within weeks, it vanished from circulation. When the ranger later asked about the status of the photo, he was told the image had been misfiled. No copy was ever found in the archives. To those who had witnessed the event, the absence of acknowledgement felt heavier than any explanation. Silence was the official language of the desert, and once again it spoke louder than words. As the 1970s passed into the 1980s, the silence of official channels grew thicker, but so too did the testimonies. Workers on the base itself, men and women sworn to secrecy by oaths and contracts, occasionally broke that silence in whispers. Through anonymous letters and carefully disguised accounts, they described nights when the desert sky above Groom Lake filled with spheres of light. These were not aircraft in any recognizable form, nor were they flares or reflections. Witnesses described pulsating spheres that glowed in muted colors, amber, red, sometimes blue, hovering low above the lake bed. They remained suspended for long minutes before vanishing in silence, as though they had never existed. In one account preserved through an underground newsletter circulated in Nevada in the early 1980s, a former technician wrote of walking outside the hangars after midnight to find the desert illuminated by 3 orbs hovering in perfect triangular formation. He claimed the air around them felt charged and his own radio equipment fell silent, its channels filled only with static. The orbs did not move like machines under test. They shifted with an unearthly rhythm, sliding without inertia, disappearing only when attention seemed most fixed upon them. These testimonies carried the weight of proximity. Unlike distant tourists or passing motorists, these were individuals who lived and worked under the shadow of the base. They were accustomed to experimental flights, to the roar of engines and the glow of afterburners. What they described was nothing of the sort. It was something foreign, outside the language of aeronautics, something that left behind no contrails, no echoes on radar, no trace except the silence that followed. Every case, whether seen by civilians or those within the perimeter, followed the same pattern of reaction. The lights would be described, sometimes photographed, occasionally measured, but always absorbed into silence. Officials offered explanations that spoke more to dismissal than investigation. Optical illusions, reflections of Venus, atmospheric inversions, even fatigue were cited as reasons. Yet the witnesses, separated by time, profession, and distance, repeated details too consistent to ignore. The hovering, the pulsing, the sudden vanishing, all were described in language that overlapped across decades. The desert itself became a stage where the same performance was repeated, year after year, with no variation in its ending. There was light, there was silence, and then there was nothing. For those who had seen the flashes, the absence of explanation was more haunting than any official acknowledgement could have been. The flashes on the horizon did not simply mark moments of illumination, they became reminders of the limits of perception, of how easily truth could be dismissed in favor of silence. The horizon above Groom Lake carried a weight all its own. To stand there was to confront a space where light could appear without origin and vanish without destination. Each flash, whether caught on a photograph or etched into memory, deepened the legend of the place. By the close of the 1980s, Area 51 was no longer simply a name whispered in speculation. It had become a living myth, constructed not by revelation, but by repetition, by the steady accumulation of unexplained lights that rose and fell across the desert horizon. In 1989, the desert silence fractured not by light on the horizon, but by words spoken into cameras and radios. A man named Robert Lazar appeared in public, his identity at first veiled behind a pseudonym and shadow, later revealed openly. He claimed he had worked not in the visible expanse of Groom Lake, but in hidden hangars embedded into the mountainside south of the base, a place he called S4. His account was unlike any rumor that had preceded it. He spoke not of lights in the sky seen from a distance, but of proximity, of technology not meant for human eyes. According to Lazar, the underground hangars housed 9 distinct craft, each with a shape that resisted simple description. Some resembled discs, others more complex geometries, all with surfaces that seemed seamless, as though molded in a single piece. He described them not as prototypes of human design, but as objects recovered, their origin extraterrestrial. Within these hangars, under constant surveillance and strict compartmentalization, teams attempted to reverse engineer their function. Lazar described the centerpiece of these attempts as a reactor fueled by an element unknown to the periodic table of the time, an isotope he called element 1-15. It was, he said, the source of a directed gravitational field, a mechanism that allowed the craft to bend space and move without conventional propulsion. He spoke of a device he called the gravity amplifier, a structure that emitted focused distortion fields. In his account, when powered, the craft could rise silently from the desert floor, unaffected by inertia, immune to drag. He described watching such tests himself, where the craft lifted smoothly into the air, hovering as though anchored by invisible threads, then darted across the night sky at impossible speeds, vanishing before the eye could trace their path. These words did not remain confined to obscure interviews. They were carried across national broadcasts, printed in newspapers, and debated in late-night discussions. The claims ignited immediate controversy. Skeptics dismissed them as fabrication, an elaborate story woven for attention. Scientists countered with the assertion that no stable isotope of element 115 was known, and no evidence of such a reactor existed in human research. Yet the timing of Lazar's revelations coincided with reports from the outskirts of Groom Lake, near the small desert town of Rachel. Night after night, groups of civilians gathered on ridges and highways, watching the distant base. Many reported luminous objects rising above the horizon, hovering, then accelerating at sharp angles, movements beyond the capability of known aircraft. Journalists traveled to Rachel and interviewed witnesses. Farmers, truckers, and travelers described lights that shifted colors, glowed intensely, then vanished without sound. Some carried cameras and recorded streaks of brightness against the desert sky, indistinct yet persistent. Their descriptions mirrored the imagery Lazar had given: silent ascents, abrupt changes in trajectory, vanishing points that left only darkness in their wake. Researchers cataloged these testimonies, comparing them to official flight schedules. On several nights when lights were reported, no aircraft were logged in the region, no exercises announced. The weight of Lazar's claims rested not only on his descriptions, but on the atmosphere of secrecy surrounding the base itself. Area 51 was already an enigma, but his testimony provided it with a new dimension, turning speculation into the possibility of direct evidence. His account of 9 craft aligned with whispers that had circulated among certain circles of aviation enthusiasts and defense contractors who spoke, always anonymously, of shapes glimpsed under tarps, of convoys transporting unusual cargo under armed guard. As the story spread, pressure on officials increased. Questions were directed at the Department of Defense and the Air Force. The responses remained consistent, terse, and dismissive. Area 51, they stated, was an airfield used for testing advanced aircraft, nothing more. They denied the existence of programs related to extraterrestrial technology. Yet the absence of explanation did little to erase the growing conviction among those who had seen the desert lights that Lazar's words carried some truth. Reports from Rachel multiplied during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Visitors gathered along the extraterrestrial highway, as it came to be called, to watch the skies. Some nights remained still, nothing but stars and the hum of distant insects. On others, luminous points appeared suddenly, cutting across the horizon in silence, performing maneuvers no commercial jet could match. Witnesses recalled objects that hovered, darted, then shot vertically, vanishing into the upper atmosphere in seconds. Many noted the absence of engine noise, the lack of sonic booms despite speeds that seemed to exceed Mach thresholds. The parallels were undeniable. Lazar had spoken of gravity-driven propulsion, of machines unbound by inertia. Civilians reported lights behaving exactly as if such principles were in use. Whether coincidence or corroboration, the testimonies began to weave together. Researchers who once dismissed the desert lights as illusions began to reconsider. If the accounts were fabrications, they were remarkably consistent across witnesses separated by distance and time. In Rachel, the atmosphere shifted. The town became a quiet focal point of the legend. Motels filled with visitors hoping to glimpse the unexplained. Roadside diners collected stories from travelers who had watched the horizon flare with sudden light. Some described disorientation, a pressure in the ears, or the inexplicable dimming of car headlights as the objects passed. These physical effects echoed earlier reports from the 1960s and 1970s but gained new resonance against the backdrop of Lazar's words. Within the defense community, Lazar's claims triggered speculation of a different kind. Some insiders suggested the possibility that his testimony was disinformation, a deliberate narrative designed to distract from classified human projects. Others suspected that his access had been partial, his knowledge real but fragmented, offered to him in a controlled way to test how the information would spread. The secrecy around the base ensured that no definitive resolution emerged. For the public, however, the line between rumor and revelation blurred. To many, the testimonies from within, spoken by a man who claimed first-hand knowledge, merged seamlessly with the lights witnessed by dozens of civilians. Together, they formed a story that stretched beyond coincidence, a legend where hidden hangars and silent craft became as real in the collective imagination as the desert itself. By the early 1990s, Area 51 was no longer only a restricted military zone. It had become the embodiment of secrecy, a symbol of the boundary between what was known and what remained concealed. Lazar's testimony, whether factual or fabricated, acted as a catalyst. His words gave structure to decades of scattered sightings. His descriptions offered an explanation, however controversial, for the flashes and orbs that had haunted the desert skies. In the end, the testimonies from within were not confined to Lazar alone. They included the silent witnesses of Rachel, the tourists who watched the horizon burn with sudden light, the farmers who saw their animals stirred by unseen forces. Each account, small in isolation, converged into a larger narrative. It was a narrative of machines that rose without sound, of skies that held more than stars, of a base whose fences contained not only secrets of steel and fuel, but perhaps something that defied the boundaries of human origin. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the rhythm of sightings did not fade but shifted in character, acquiring the weight of repeated testimonies, unfiled reports, and private confessions made only after careers had ended. The desert remained silent, but its silence held interruptions. Arcs of light that appeared where no aircraft were scheduled, pulses that illuminated ridges for seconds at a time, and shadows cast without sources. Each incident settled briefly in the consciousness of those who saw it, then disappeared under the same cloak of denial that had always shielded Groom Lake. In 1994, rumors surfaced from a circle of engineers employed by EGA&G, a contractor long associated with technical infrastructure at Groom Lake. Their accounts never appeared in formal statements, but circulated in whispered exchanges, later reaching researchers who compiled fragments. According to these men, luminous orbs had appeared near the peaks of Tikaboo, visible from the ridgeline east of the base. They described the objects as spheres of soft light, sometimes amber, sometimes bluish-white, hovering motionless for minutes before drifting in silence across the valley floor. Some claimed the orbs dissolved suddenly, as if extinguished, while others said they shot upward, vanishing into the atmosphere in seconds. None of the engineers spoke publicly under their names. The accounts reached the outside world through intermediaries, noted in marginal newsletters and scattered interviews. The orbs became another pattern layered on decades of mystery. Through the late 1990s, more isolated testimonies followed. Hunters along the Nevada Test Range recounted nights where skyglow appeared in geometric forms, rectangles of faint luminescence hovering low before dissipating. Truckers on the extraterrestrial highway spoke of flashes behind the mountains, white bursts that briefly silhouetted the ridges. Each observation found its way into a growing archive maintained not by the government, but by civilian researchers, many of them amateur yet consistent in documentation. The federal record, by contrast, remained absent. In 2001, fragments of new testimony reached journalists through former contractors who had completed assignments at the base. These men described plasma-like bursts, sudden explosions of radiant energy emanating from within the restricted zone. According to their accounts, the bursts did not resemble conventional weapons testing or flares. Instead, they seemed contained, rising briefly above closed hangars before dispersing without smoke, without trails. The descriptions carried echoes of earlier reports of pulsing spheres, as though the phenomenon persisted but adapted, shifting in appearance while retaining its silence. The contractors, interviewed only under condition of anonymity, spoke carefully. They did not claim extraterrestrial origin. They described what they had seen, left the interpretation to others, and retreated once again into silence. The early 2000s marked a paradoxical moment. Interest in Area 51 expanded in popular culture. Books, television segments, and speculative documentaries proliferated, each presenting the base as a nexus of secrecy. Yet for every headline, official acknowledgement remained absent. Freedom of Information Act requests yielded heavily redacted documents, sheets of paper where paragraphs dissolved into black ink. Researchers sifted through these fragments, noting dates, project names, and logistical details, but finding nothing that explained the nocturnal lights. The absence itself became a kind of record, a shadow archive where silence served as evidence of what was withheld. In 2013, a milestone arrived. The Central Intelligence Agency released a declassified history of aerial reconnaissance programs, acknowledging formally for the first time that Area 51 existed. For decades, its presence on maps had been denied, its name avoided. Now, in a handful of pages, the agency confirmed what was already known to every researcher and enthusiast. Groom Lake was real, its facilities tied to the U-2 and A-12 programs, its secrecy justified under the rubric of national defense. The revelation should have closed a chapter, but it opened another. For while the existence of the base was admitted, none of the unexplained phenomena were addressed. The glowing spheres, the bursts of plasma, the vertical ascents into the night sky remained untouched. The CIA report, clinical in tone, listed aircraft projects and logistical challenges. It acknowledged test flights mistaken for unidentified objects, noting how the U-2's high altitude in the 1950s had created confusion among commercial pilots. But it did not explain why sightings persisted decades after those early prototypes had been retired. It did not address why civilian cameras captured luminous arcs over the desert in the 1980s, or why engineers whispered of orbs hovering over Tikaboo in the 1990s. The report carried the weight of revelation, but offered none of the answers demanded by the legend. Observers noted the pattern. Each official disclosure, when it came, served not to illuminate, but to reinforce silence. The acknowledgement of Area 51's existence did nothing to resolve the mystery of what had occurred above it. The documents became markers not of truth but of boundaries, outlining what could be admitted while leaving the rest unspoken. This gap, the space between acknowledgement and denial, became fertile ground for speculation. Amid this atmosphere, reports continued. In 2006, hikers along the Nevada ranges described a triangular formation of lights that hovered soundlessly before dispersing. In 2009, amateur astronomers recording meteor showers near Rachel captured streaks on film that accelerated against the expected trajectory of falling objects. In 2011, a commercial pilot on approach to Las Vegas reported an unidentified luminous object ascending rapidly from restricted airspace before vanishing from radar. Each incident was documented by enthusiasts, collected in databases, and filed alongside earlier decades of sightings. Each was met with the same official silence. By the time of the CIA acknowledgement in 2013, the archive of hidden traces had grown immense. Thousands of pages, photographs, and recordings existed outside the realm of classified secrecy, held by civilians rather than governments. Yet within official channels, the record remained skeletal. No explanation for the glowing spheres, no account of plasma bursts, no mention of vertical ascents. The absence was so deliberate it became part of the phenomenon itself. For those who studied these patterns, the lesson was stark. The desert offered glimpses but never clarity. The documents confirmed projects of steel and fuel, but the lights that hovered above the mountains belonged to another ledger, one never shared. The hidden traces persisted not only in the testimonies of witnesses, but in the blank spaces of official files. And as the years passed, each new silence became another form of acknowledgement, as though the most guarded secret of Area 51 was not what it contained, but what it refused to name. By the second decade of the 21st century, the perimeter of Groom Lake remained as sealed and unyielding as it had been during the most intense years of the Cold War. The fences stretched for miles, marked by weather-beaten warning signs threatening arrest, fines, and the possibility of deadly force. Sensors hidden beneath the sand detected even the smallest movements. High-mounted cameras rotated silently, tracking dust trails and heat signatures. Patrols in unmarked vehicles traced the ridgelines, their presence constant, their insignia absent. The desert itself seemed to participate in the surveillance, the emptiness amplifying every intrusion, every shadow crossing the dry earth. Tourists continued to arrive, drawn by curiosity as much as by the mythology that had accumulated like sediment over decades. They drove along Highway 375, the long desolate stretch officially marked only as a state route, but informally christened the extraterrestrial highway. From the roadside near the town of Rachel, visitors pointed cameras toward distant horizons, waiting for the flashes that others swore appeared without warning. At night, some recorded arcs of light drifting over the mountains. Others claimed to see sudden bursts that lit up the desert floor for a heartbeat before vanishing. Each sighting entered online forums and late-night broadcasts, adding to the growing mosaic of testimony. Inside official channels, the language did not change. Reports used words stripped of certainty, terms that repeated like ritual, unidentified, unconfirmed, unresolved. The pattern endured across decades, a vocabulary that offered nothing but absence. Where civilians described glowing spheres, documents spoke of optical artifacts. Where hunters recalled triangular formations of lights, memoranda cited airborne test activity. The void between what was seen and what was recorded became the ground on which the legend flourished. For those who sought the truth, the silence carried its own gravity. It was not a void born of ignorance but of design. The refusal to confirm or deny hardened into a form of control, an invisible wall stronger than any fence or patrol. Each unanswered question deepened the myth, making the unknown larger than the known. In this way, silence functioned as both shield and weapon. It protected what lay inside Groom Lake, whether aircraft prototypes or something more unusual, and it disoriented those outside, leaving them trapped in speculation. Witnesses continued to emerge, though rarely in public. Pilots spoke cautiously after retirement, describing maneuvers that violated aerodynamics. Locals in Rachel admitted to seeing vertical ascents into clear skies, but avoided pressing details, knowing attention often brought ridicule. Researchers scoured declassified files only to find the same patterns: heavy redactions, blank pages, references that led to nothing. The absence became an echo chamber where rumor replaced fact, and yet the accumulation of silence itself formed a record of its own. By the 2010s, Area 51 had become more than a location. It was a cultural symbol embedded in films, novels, and conspiracy theories, a shorthand for secrecy itself. The myth had detached from the soil of Nevada and entered the collective imagination, where it mutated freely. People who had never stood in the desert spoke of the base as though it were a stage where human and alien narratives overlapped. This diffusion served the same function as official silence. It scattered attention, making it impossible to separate fragments of truth from layers of fiction, even when the U.S. government shifted in tone, admitting the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena in separate contexts. The approach to Groom Lake remained unchanged. The words came carefully, acknowledging observation without explanation, confirming nothing beyond the fact that something had been seen. The silence continued to do its work, more effective than denial. For those who traveled to the periphery of the base, the weight of silence was palpable. At night, standing near the black mailbox along Highway 375, they felt the emptiness of the desert pressing in. The mountains absorbed sound, leaving only the wind and the occasional crackle of static on a radio. When a flash appeared on the horizon, whether natural or engineered, it was swallowed almost instantly by the vastness. What lingered was not the light itself, but the uncertainty it produced. That uncertainty, multiplied across years and witnesses, became the essence of the Area 51 legend. Files accumulated in archives, thick folders marked by bureaucratic stamps and coded designations. They contained scattered references to aerial encounters, but each entry was stripped of finality. No definitive conclusions, only repetition, unidentified, unconfirmed, unexplained. The words became incantations, reinforcing the boundary between knowledge and secrecy. In these gray folders, silence became tangible, a force preserved on paper. For the men and women who worked beyond the fences, silence was a condition of survival. Security briefings repeated the rules relentlessly. Nothing seen was to be described, nothing unusual was to be acknowledged. Careers and livelihoods depended on adherence. The silence became routine, woven into the structure of life around Groom Lake. Yet beyond routine, it was also a strategy, shaping the perception of outsiders. By refusing to speak, the base allowed imagination to supply its own explanations, each one reinforcing the aura of the unknown. In the end, the desert itself mirrored the secrecy. Groom Lake remained dry, flat, reflective, its surface bearing no signs of what had passed above it. The mountains stood immovable, their ridges hiding the runways and hangars from view. The silence spread outward from the perimeter, across the scrubland, across the empty highway, until it became indistinguishable from the natural quiet of the Nevada night. What frightened most observers was not the possibility of alien craft or secret weapons, but the realization that silence itself could hold so much. The refusal to answer left questions suspended indefinitely, as though the truth had been placed out of reach, not by walls or guards, but by an absence engineered to endure. In that silence, more durable than steel, the greatest secret of Area 51 was preserved. Not what was hidden, but how effectively it remained hidden.